Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ken Berlin, and I'm a Senior Fellow and Director of the Financing and Achieving Cost-Competitive Climate Solutions Project at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and we have the distinct pleasure to be joined by Senator Chris Van Hollen and excellent panelists to discuss the importance and role of a national green bank in accelerating an equitable transition to a clean energy economy. I'm going to start with a short introduction on what a green bank is, and then turn the microphone over to Senator Van Hollen, who's been the leading proponent supporting green banks on the Hill in both the House and the Senate for over 10 years. He has been joined in this effort by Senator Markey and Congresswoman Dingell. Green banks are financing entities funded primarily by public funds that provide funding to energy projects that are unable to proceed because of barriers to being able to obtain funding. For example, a project in a low-income neighborhood or less developed country might be deemed riskier than other projects, and the resulting higher interest rates might raise the cost of the energy too much for the project to proceed and to be able to generate energy at a cost-competitive rate. In poorer communities in the US and in less developed countries, individuals, communities, and states might not be able to put up any upfront capital, making it very difficult to fund the project unless they receive 100% upfront funding. There may be no local history for the kind of project seeking financing or for individuals or communities seeking loans, and this can make funding very difficult. And even with larger projects, they might not be able to obtain loans because of specific risk factors to their project or because of interest rates that are rising now. So in other words, green banks step in when existing funding is not available to projects, even though the projects are important in the fight to transition to an equitable clean energy economy, and even though there's vast amounts of these projects that are out there. Green banks can address these problems using many tools, including low interest rate loans, 100% upfront financing, credit enhancements, loan loss reserves, and other measures. The first green bank was set up in Connecticut over 10 years ago. Currently, there are 23 green banks in 17 states in the American Green Bank Consortium. Some are state and some are local, as well as green banks in other countries. After over 10 years of efforts to pass green bank legislation at the federal level, the Inflation Reduction Act authorized $27 billion to establish the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Of that amount, $20 billion can be distributed to green banks, $8 billion of which must go to poor and disadvantaged communities. Although supporters of green banks and its congressional sponsors have always argued for a single national green bank, the legislation leaves this open, largely for technical reasons relating to the reconciliation process. So in addition to talking about green banks in general, the questions that we are addressing in this discussion is, should the funds be distributed through a national green bank? And if so, how would the national green bank work? Our first and keynote speaker will be Senator Chris Van Hollen. Senator Van Hollen became a member of the House of Representatives in 2003, and he stayed there until 2007 when he was elected to the Senate. He's been responsible for many important pieces of legislation. He was a leader among the House leadership, and he has been, as I said, the key proponent for green banks. So I will now turn this over to the senator to discuss how the sponsors of legislation intended the funds to be distributed. Thank you, Senator. We really appreciate you being here today. We know how busy you are during an election year, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you for focusing on this really important topic, and thank you for your longtime involvement in the Green Bank movement. I appreciate the fact that the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center is hosting this forum this afternoon, and I'm pleased to be joined by my friend and colleague and longtime supporter of green banks, Reed Hunt, as well as the other distinguished panelists, Will Barber III, Brian Garcia, and Kathy Mahan. Thank all of you for your work in this area. Just at the top line level, I'm a firm believer that investing in clean energy through a national climate bank will generate millions of jobs. It will help boost our economy and sharpen our competitive edge, especially when other countries are really investing as well in this area. And very importantly, a national climate bank will support the movement for environmental justice. As you said, Ken, in many cases, it's some of the organizations, very worthy organizations in lower income areas, disadvantaged communities that cannot get the capital that they need. And a national green bank would be able to provide this on a national basis and fill those gaps in a smart way. The Coalition for Green Capital, and you're going to hear from them shortly, has identified already $20 billion in projects that would benefit from a national clean bank. I do also want to put this a little bit in a global perspective, because in order for us to be globally competitive, we've got to take these steps. If you look at the Made in China 2025 plan, they put investment in clean energy front and center. And that's true from when they first introduced it years ago to their most recent version of that 5-year plan. And they've poured $380 billion into clean energy production, almost double what the United States has invested in clean energy. And we saw what happens when we get way behind our global competitors in the area of 5G. And so this is important for that reason, and it's important for making those grassroots local investments here in the United States. As you said, Ken, thank you for recognizing our efforts over a long period of time. You were part of that original launch, as was Reed Hunt and others. And the idea, of course, was to provide a national mechanism to make these kinds of investments. When that did not pass the House more than 10 years ago, we did see a flourishing of some local green banks and state green banks, and you mentioned that. But in order to take this idea to scale, we've always envisioned a national green bank, national climate bank. The names have changed, that the overall vision has been the same. And I've introduced a version of this every year since we did not get it out of the House. And finally, I'm really glad to have teamed up, as you said, with Senator Ed Markey and Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. And we introduced a bill that would accomplish those goals. And the ideas behind those bills can now be realized through the Inflation Reduction Act, and very specifically, as you said, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. And we have worked to position this idea within that portion of the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's our goal and vision that around $20 billion of that $27 billion fund would be used to capitalize a national green bank with the purpose of generating more jobs, and very specifically, the purpose of investing in communities that have often been overlooked and overburdened by pollution, including lower income communities and communities of color. And that means that there would be within that umbrella under the National Climate Bank, opportunities for all sorts of organizations to participate. But it's our view that in order to get the leverage that we think this can get in terms of private sector investment as well, a national bank can deliver that. And it's our expectation that we can get about 10 times a multiplier effect from this structure at the national level. And that means if you, for example, capitalize the Green Bank at $20 billion, you're talking about $200 billion over time. And again, if you look at our original framework with respect to the climate bank, we propose to meet the president's vision and our vision of 40% of those funds going for environmental justice initiatives. And if you take $20 billion as the overall number for a national climate bank. That would mean at least $8 billion of investment going toward those communities and those purposes. Our overall estimate is that 3 million jobs would be generated over the next few years if we were to capitalize the National Climate Bank at this level. And there are already hundreds of millions of dollars worth of initiatives at the local level in communities that have been traditionally disadvantaged and overlooked, ready to go, that could be served by this national structure. So to make a long story short, it's been a long time getting to this point because of the reconciliation process. And just to interpret what Ken said about the process, to get it through the reconciliation process, we had to essentially take the pieces of the legislation for the National Climate Bank, dismantle them, but create the seeds for those programs within the reconciliation bill that would then be sort of reconstructed by the EPA when it goes forward with its process. And Senators Markey, myself, and Congresswoman Dingell have written to the EPA Administrator Regan about exactly this concept. We've been in touch with the White House from even before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed with this vision. And we're glad to be here right on the edge of making that happen, finally, with the resources available. But really look to all the panelists here and others joining for their vision on how we flesh out the details. So I'm sorry I'm going to have to run now, but I do have members of my team who are on board watching, and we look forward to the ideas that come out of the panel and the recommendations that come out of any discussion following that. So thank you, Ken and the Atlantic Council for pulling this together, and we look forward to making this vision a reality in the near future. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us. Before we start the panel discussion, I have several reminders. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag AC Energy. Second, we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. I will try to answer as many of these as I can. If you're watching on another platform like YouTube, unfortunately, we cannot take your questions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our virtual panel. First, Reed Hundt. As you've heard, Reed Hundt is the founder and CEO of the Coalition for Green Capital. Not only has been the leading advocate of green banks, in many ways, he's singularly responsible for the passage of this legislation, for all the work on that. There were many down moments over the many years we've been trying to get this through. Reed always brought us through this. Whenever there was difficulties, instead of looking at something that's difficult, he always had a new idea. So he's been a major player in this, and I think you'll enjoy what he has to say. Brian Garcia is the president and CEO of the Connecticut Green Bank. Connecticut Green Bank was the first green bank passed, and Brian really led the effort of figuring out how to develop programs in that, what works, what doesn't work, how to deal with communities of color and poor communities. Will Barber is the Director of Climate and Environmental Justice at the Climate Reality Project and the Chief Consultant on Environmental Justice and Equity at the Coalition for Green Capital. He's been a leader of not only looking at this issue and advocating it, but also expressing the needs of the needs of the environmental justice communities, how we should interact with them, how we should listen to them in their programs to make sure that we develop the best programs to help in this ensure environmental equity. And Kathy Mahon is the president and CEO at Inclusive, an organization is building a more inclusive economies through community-owned and controlled financial institutions like credit unions, community developed finance institutions, and she has really worked obviously with these organizations to work on energy issues. So with that, let me start with Reed. And I'm going to ask questions of each panelist to start with. Reed, could you describe how you envision a national green bank would work? And tell us why you think we need a national green bank as compared to funds being distributed through many entities.
Okay, hi. Well, first of all, Ken, the world should know that you're the co-founder of the Coalition for Green Capital, and that 12 years ago, you got your law firm to write the bylaws and charters and launch us. So you use the word singular. There's nothing more plural than the effort that has led to the accomplishment that Chris outlined, and it needs to get even bigger. So really simply, what I think Chris was talking about, and I know that we've talked about with everybody for now, this December will be 14 straight years since this whole idea was presented to the Obama team. What we've always wanted was a single national green bank, that in turn would be able to distribute the funds and technical assistance to Kathy Mahan's organization, to Brian Garcia, but also to dozens and dozens and dozens of others. Chris was talking about the $20 billion of backlog that right now rest in the plans of 23 green banks in 17 states. Just to give you a sense of the order of magnitude, the most recent McKinsey work about the investment need for clean power in the United States is that every single year we need to add $600 billion of investment for the next 20 years straight. We need to add $600 billion in clean power investment in just the United States every year for 20 years straight. That may seem, wow, that's so much more than right now is actually going on, or so much more than the 20 billion. Two things to be said about that. Number one, that kind of major shift in investment is the same order of magnitude as the rebuilding of our communications sector down the lines of the internet and of wireless, which occurred starting in the early 90s and stretched into the middle of the next decade. Meaning we've done this kind of makeover of a sector before. Number two, that cannot be done without dozens and actually hundreds of local entities finding the deals, doing the underwriting, striking the bargains, making the investment, paying attention to the results, talking to the contractors. So when we talk about a single national green bank, and Chris called it an umbrella, sometimes I call it a tent, because a tent is usually bigger than an umbrella. So we want that big tent, and we want not just everybody who already is interested, like Kathy or Brian, but people that haven't heard about this yet. That maybe Kathy hasn't called yet, that maybe will not get with the program until the next year or the year after. But we have a wonderful ecosystem of nonprofits and of nonprofit financial institutions. We need that whole ecosystem to move under this big tent. I think that's, number one, the only way to be fair. Meaning, if we only look at the people, institutions, and individuals who already are engaged, then we're not going to be including all those who have yet to come under that tent. And we need to have the vision that we will provide funding and technical assistance for them too. Number two, we need all communities to be the beneficiaries, particularly, as Chris was saying, those overlooked communities, those particularly disadvantaged communities. And in that respect, I just want to mention two things that right now are facts in America. 1 out of every 6 households is behind in their utility bills. 1 out of every 6. They're not all in one place, but they can be found. They can be mapped, and sadly, they are concentrated in certain districts, in certain geographic areas. So we're going to need to address those particular issues by putting extra funds and extra assistance right there. That's one problem. Here's the second problem. There are about 230 of communities that have a coal-fired boiler. That facility over the last 40 years typically was the source of economic growth and of job creation. It produced an energy surplus in those places where those 230 boilers are located. And so it attracted other businesses. But the transition means that those boilers need to go out of business. So now we know the communities that are going to need an alternative. It's not 2,000, it's 230. So we're going to have to all work together with that under that big umbrella and say, well, let's name the communities, let's find the institution. Maybe it's somebody in Kathy's membership organization. Let's put extra funding right there because we know that that's a community that has to go through the crisis, a transition, but it may be in crisis. Very quickly, I want to talk about the point that Chris made about leverage. So this is banking talk, right? So here's the way it works. First of all, you deposit, let's call it 20 billion because the math is a little easier than when you say 27. You put 20 billion, you immediately borrow on top of that about 2 billion. Let's call that borrowing green bonds, but you've doubled the spending power. The next thing you want to do is combine that money, that public money that was supported by the public money, with private money. The green banks that I know about over the last 10 years have been able to increase the total investment by the public-private alchemy by about 3 times. So first I doubled the money, then I multiplied it by 3. The next thing is that it's possible for that same money to be aggregated. The loans are then bundled, then they're sold, and so the money is recycled, and you get another doubling. Now, there's still a fourth piece of magic. I am convinced that if we aggregate this money at the national level and then have this huge network that is constantly growing, what we're going to do is create a financial opportunity that will attract other types of investors, impact investors, not just the federal government, but other impact investors. And I want to believe that that again will double the money. Well, the magic of all these doublings is that you multiply them times each other. At the maximum, you get close to 20 times the spending over a 10-year period, maybe even more than 20 times. Is that a number too big to believe? Well, I just want to go back to what I said earlier. Even that number is smaller than the additional amount of investing that we need to create the clean power platform. So we are not the exclusive solution. Our solution has to be bundled with the other strategic measures that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, like the tax credit program, like the loan program office, and like the rebates. And it also has to lead to the drawing in of much more private sector investment on its own without our magnetic power over time. That's saying a lot in a hurry. It also means a lot of work for a lot of people over a 10-year period. But what I really love about where we are right now is, after all these years, we do have the legislation, and we do have the money, and we do have a collaborative exercise to go forward, and we can have the right strategy, and we can execute, and so we can win the battle against climate change, and we can win the battle for environmental justice at last.
Okay, thank you, Reed. Appreciate that. Brian, could you describe the barriers to financing that your bank and other green banks have been able to overcome, and how you think a national green bank could help state green banks grow and prosper?
Great. Well, thank you for having me with this crew here today, Ken. I wanted to add to the accolades of Senator Van Hollen and Reed here in terms of your involvement in the green bank movement. There you were back in 2011. I think you spent a lot of late nights working with the Connecticut General Assembly to effectively reconstitute an existing authority in Connecticut and create the nation's first green bank in Public Act 1180, Section 99 of 136 section bill. I'm sure you're very intimate with that Section 99 piece. So thank you very much for all that you've done over the years. And Reed was a board member of the Connecticut Green Bank through a lot that we went through. So the coalition's been very active. When we think about the role of the Green Bank here in Connecticut, every locality, every state has different challenges that we're trying to grapple with in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, the White House says, sets a target of 40% reductions from 2005 levels by 2030. Connecticut has a greenhouse gas emission reduction target of 45% reductions based on 2001 levels by 2030. That actually matches up with the 50% target of 2005 levels by 2030 that the White House is aspiring towards. So we have really ambitious public policies. We have ambitious renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency standards, weatherization targets. So when you think about what's the role of a green bank in this context of trying to achieve these ambitious public policies, the Connecticut Green Bank, we're a quasi-public. So we sit in between the public sector and the private sector. And our role really as an intermediary is to communicate to the private sector that the opportunities that have been created in Connecticut as a result of public policy demand your attention and demand your investment. And to the extent the Green Bank can play a role in a capital structure, in a joint investment to attract your capital to help families and businesses reduce their energy costs, then that's what we're going to focus on. So in terms of filling the gaps, a couple thoughts come to mind, just kind of building a bridge to Kathy here. One of the programs that we developed was a second loan loss reserve with our local community banks and credit unions. The public policy was to develop a financing product for single family homeowners to achieve the comprehensive energy strategy of the state of Connecticut, which meant that we had to get credit unions to move beyond their unsecured terms of 5 years and get them to 7, 10, 12, 20-year terms that match the useful lives of these energy measures. So we created the Smarty loan, and by we, I really mean our team. This is really about the people that you bring on board to address these problems. I think we've created a culture here at the Connecticut Green Bank of a thank God it's Monday kind of attitude to confront the climate crisis. So we're all as green bankers focused on that. But in terms of the Smarty loan program, we provide a second loss to local community banks and credit unions to provide easy and affordable access to capital to finance those clean energy improvements. They take the first loss. We want them to take that. We want them to continue with their typical underwriting. But what we want them to learn is that by lending unsecured in this space, that they will effectively achieve the returns that they're after, while at the same time helping the state of Connecticut achieve its clean energy policies. So we have, over the first 8 years of that Smarty loan program, had over 6,600 loans going to families in the state that has provided over $110 million of capital from those local community banks and credit unions. And we've only had to pay $300,000 in losses. So that is a case of using a credit enhancement tool to enable our local lenders to be involved in helping us achieve our climate targets. The other program that comes to my mind is more of a structured finance product, where in Connecticut, we wanted to ensure that our low to moderate income families and communities of color are demanding solar PV, just like non-LMI families, just like white families. We did some data collection back in 2014 that clearly showed that we were missing the mark. We were definitely enabling more private investment in solar deployment on residential rooftops. But when you broke it down, we were clearly missing low income and communities of color. We did some research. The research showed that just because you're low income doesn't mean you have poor credit. So there's unconscious bias in the market that just because you're low income, you're bad credit. That's not the case. They're not correlated here in Connecticut. So we shared that research with the market. We manage a performance-based incentive. We doubled that incentive for families that can demonstrate need for low income. That still didn't attract investment in the market. What we had to actually do is to actively go out and find a contractor in the market who was willing to support targeting low-income families. We issued an RFP, a request for proposals. We found a company called Posigen out of New Orleans, Louisiana. We brought them up to Connecticut. We surrounded them in Bridgeport, one of our low-income disadvantaged communities. It is one of those communities, Ken, that you're talking about, and Reed, these energy communities that have had prior coal-fired power plants, environmental justice communities. This community has now deployed the most rooftop solar in the state, making Connecticut a solar with justice state, which is low-income families and communities of color, Black and Hispanic families are demanding solar more than non-LMI and white families. And that's because we played a part in a capital structure. We took some risk. And now these families are reducing their energy burden, their percentage of household income spent on energy from 10, 15, 20% of household income, now back to what's affordable, 6%. So we want to continue that activity. We see energy security on our horizon. We want to put batteries in those homes too, to not only deliver them that energy burden reduction, but also to deliver them that energy security. So when climate hits and the grid goes out, their power is still on. So those are a few examples of tools where we've been able to fill a void to advance the public policy objectives of the state of Connecticut while making Connecticut a place for more private investment. I guess the final thing I'd add quickly is that as we've administered public revenues, and we've taken about $300 million of public revenues over the first decade, we invest that. We've enabled $1.9 billion of private investment on top of that. That's the leverage ratio. And those public revenues now shows on our balance sheet. We don't give it away, we loan it out. So now we've got a really strong balance sheet that we're continuing to leverage to attract more private investment alongside us to build this green economy. So I'll just end there.
Okay, again, thank you, Brian. Will, could you talk about the role of green banks in low income and disadvantaged communities and how you think green banks should interact with community members?
Thank you so much for the question, Ken, and really glad to join all of my fellow panelists here. I think that many of us in this space have recognized that as we have a surge for national demand for clean energy investments that are able to be deployed by green banks, it also means that we must establish a strong recommitment to continue and deepen work around climate justice, energy justice, and environmental justice. And to put just a quick lens on that, I want to highlight some figures of the problem when we talk about those concepts, even as we're talking about solutions. I mean, right now, we're existing in a reality where 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of those coal-fired boilers, those power plants that we've talked about. Right now, we're living with the remnants of a legacy where African Americans are 74.5% more likely than their white counterparts to live in fence-line communities close to oil and gas infrastructure that pollutes our air and changes our climate. It means right now that in 46 out of 50 United States, people of color live with more air pollution than their white counterparts. So when that is the reality, we have to recognize that any climate policy that aims to enable a just transition will need to take into account these historic injustices and discrepancies. So that means that we have to continue to advocate and advance energy equity by increasing access to clean technology and workforce and entrepreneurial opportunities for communities of color and poor and low-income neighborhoods. It means that we have to ensure that we're leading in the development of innovative products that are responsive to the unique needs and situations of these communities. It means that environmentally just policy has to strive to reduce the burden of energy costs on these households. And luckily, green banks have a proven track record of doing just that. When we think about one of the key ways that green banks really help advance this conversation on energy, climate, and environmental justice, we have to consider the market gaps that are often present in LMI communities, right? And by filling those market gaps, green banks are able to naturally create tools that can be used to create direct benefits for LMI communities, not just seeing these areas as nascent markets, which we should exploit, but areas which we need to partner and create direct benefits coming from the clean energy economy. Some ways that which green banks do this is one, the inherent flexibility to be able to drive clean investments into communities that have historically been seen as too fiscally risky for investment. Green banks are finance institutions that are designed to lower energy costs by blending that mix of public and private capital. By doing this, the bank itself is able to lower the overall cost of the project and deliver clean electricity that is competitive, is cheaper for the end user, but more importantly, it allows investments and projects in communities that traditionally have been barred from seeing the benefits of the clean economy. Green banks can provide cheap financing for most type of projects. So not only energy projects, but when we're talking about other community needs, like a community hospital, like an affordable housing development, potentially even a grocery store in an area that has a food desert. The financing model, the flexible financing model created by green banks is able to meet in many ways the unique needs of communities on the front lines. The reduction of energy costs for communities is also something that is critical. When we talk about historically high utility bills and pervasive energy burden that sweeps across frontline communities across the nation, green bank investments in clean energy can help save enough money for individuals in these communities to finance other improvements in their home, to have more disposable income, and to lower those utility costs. Green banks also expand access to clean, cheap energy by validating new financial models that we know create opportunities for the LMI and the community recipient. Green banks have demonstrated that underwriting to savings, for example, is a viable way to finance products that breaks us out of some of the barriers when we look at traditional underwriting for people who may not have a disposable income, who don't have, the benefits of robust credit. And they have shown that people with lower credit scores or people who are in LMI areas, challenging some of the intentional assumption that's in the market, that they actually are reliable borrowers for projects like rooftop solar. They are able to expand access to money-saving solar for these communities. And they have also been major financiers of community solar projects that provide cheap, clean energy to LMI communities who either rent or don't have suitable tools for solar panels and traditional projects. And inherent in that is challenging the assumption, again, that LMI areas are too risky or not in a position to receive the direct benefits of a clean energy economy. As we wrap up, a few other ways that green banks are really important in driving investments into the LMI areas, allowing LMI consumers to take full advantage of these programs. Green banks have been able to extend access to commercial PACE loans for affordable housing developments, for nonprofits, for older commercial buildings and communities, places that otherwise would not be able to access financing sources for projects. And then finally, and one thing that I think is really most important, is building in demand and supporting for locally owned businesses. As we think about this transition, as we think about clean investments, it is critically important that we talk about LMI communities on the front lines, again, not just as markets that we exploit or deploy projects, but as co-owners, as entrepreneurs, as partners as we build this big tent. And green banks create really appealing opportunities for builders and contractors and businesses who are locally based, who are in those communities, embedded and staffing people in those communities to create cheap ways to access financing for energy improvements. So when we think about the people, the businesses who are doing these jobs, who are installing these projects, we can make sure that it is the communities right there on the ground, doing it on their own behalf, doing it in partnership with those of us who are pushing this model.
Great. Thank you, Will. Kathy, could you describe your organization and how you see credit unions and community development finance institutions, for example, working to lower the energy burden in distressed and underserved communities, and how you would work with a national green bank?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ken. And I feel like coming as the cleanup hitter on this amazing lineup, I feel like there are so many different points I'd love to pull together. But basically, I think, when we think about inequities in energy policy, there's so many overlaps and intersections between the issues of redlined communities. And so, my organization is a national network of CDFI and minority designated credit unions. And our members, our credit union members, were specifically organized themselves in low income communities, in communities of color that had historically been redlined and had not had access to safe, responsible, equitable access to capital. And so, for credit unions, this concept of ownership, they're financial cooperatives. So they're organized by, for, and of the people that they're serving. And the ability to now think about, and credit unions offer kind of a wide array of financial services and credit, from basic small consumer loans to support household needs, to business financing, supporting entrepreneurship, to mortgages for first-time home buyers, and even now more and more investments in affordable housing and other sort of community facilities. And they've always sort of directed these range of activities specifically to fill the gaps in the marketplace and to be able to serve people that had not had adequate access to the capital markets and to the financial system. And so I think in a lot of ways, bringing together the movement of credit unions and CDFIs with the green banks is really an opportunity to build these kinds of bridges, to make sure that we're kind of building financing opportunities in the greening economy, and that we're addressing the issues of inequities in energy policy, the overwhelming burdens that families face with the cost of utilities and energy, the incredibly vulnerable position that so many communities are in when climate events happen, and how much harder it is to be prepared for and addressing the aftermath of climate events, because there's not sufficient capital access to be able to withstand that. So, so our network, inclusive, we're this national network. We have about 480 members in 48 states, DC and Puerto Rico. And over the past decade, I would say, really, our members have increasingly been engaging in kind of the greening of local economies. And through our Center for Resilience and Clean Energy, we designed a very targeted kind of green lending training program for both consumer residential and for commercial lenders. And we've trained now at this point over 300 community development lenders to be able to provide everything from those basic, what Reed talked about, the energy efficient appliances, replacing the appliances in your home, building out sort of opportunities to do greater energy efficiency in the homes, in local community facilities, in the hospitals, in the churches, in the schools, all the way to kind of the support and investment in green businesses. So there's a tremendous opportunity. We really see the opportunities of the CDFI world coming together with the green banks as a great way for us to sort of be able to ensure that we're working together to bridge how the capital is flowing and really address some of the historical inequities that we've all that so many communities have been facing. I think there's with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, we have an ability really to kind of see capital get invested in on-the-ground institutions, right? And in the case of credit unions, our leverage is, every dollar that gets invested in a community development credit union can be leveraged 10 to 1 in local deposits, right? So every dollar that we're investing in an on-the-ground community development credit union lender can be, can raise additional $10 worth of deposits that all goes out through equitable lending. And so lots of opportunities for leverage all the way up and down the capital spectrum there, from where, directly at the fund level, but also at the on the ground level. So we see a lot of tremendous opportunities, and we really look forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you. I think you've all laid out a terrific description of what green banks can do, why they're needed, what they've been doing, and the benefits they can bring. We're going to go to questions and answers in a minute. I have 1 or 2 questions before that. Just Reed, going back to this question of a national green bank, alternatives to a national green bank include regional banks or EPA distributing the funds directly to state and local banks and other financial institutions. Why do you support a national green bank instead of one of those alternatives?
Well, you want the biggest possible tent or umbrella. You want it to, cover the entire country, and to have it be aligned with the overall national strategy to be able to get all the efficiencies of scale, the securitization, the standardization. But the biggest point is the very first one I made. You want it to cover the entire country so that you can bring more and more and more of the kinds of institutions that Kathy was just talking about in under that tent and provide them where they really are using the capital, more capital, and where they are not, the kind of training that Kathy was just talking about, provide them that, and just sort of address each situation on its own merits. There's no particular efficiency to dividing things regionally. There's certainly no particular efficiency dividing things by a state a jurisdictional level. And if you divide it into even smaller pots, then the problem is that you can't, there's no entity to shift it from one place where the money is really needed or really being allocated to the other one. So for example, Kathy mentioned that there may be communities that face particular climate crises. Could be storm related, could be drought related, could be fire related. You want to be able to move the money around to deal with the situations where they actually exist. So that's why you want this big umbrella with not centralizing the local training, the local decision making, the local deals, all the things that Kathy was talking about, all the things that Brian was talking about, but being able to have a coherent strategy that applies to everyone in the country.
Great, thank you. And just a quick question, Will, could you tell us in a little more detail how you think a national green bank should interact with local communities and local environmental justice groups to ensure the best buy-in for projects and that projects best fit local community needs?
Yeah, Ken, that's a great question. And I'll, very quickly answer it in three buckets: internally, externally, and then outreach. I think internally, we have to make sure that whatever entity is ensuring that it scales up its organizational capacity and expertise on environmental and climate justice. That includes, who are we looking at to really build in the programming in terms of the theory of change, the concepts of a national green bank that really speaks to the commitments and the recommitting to prioritizing environmental and climate justice in its outward facing programming. I think externally, there are 6 areas that I really see as being important for community outreach. One is the ability of the National Green Bank programming to immediately create reductions in energy costs for communities. When we talk about energy burden, when we talk about one of the greatest low-hanging fruits where we can see community benefit, it is lowering energy costs and creating opportunity for clean energy expansion. Number 2 is looking at opportunities for the National Green Bank to leverage targeted programs to increase access to clean energy for communities. And that is both through the projects, which I know we keep front of mind, but it is also through the creating of examples and building of green awareness in low and moderate income communities, in environmental justice communities, who we have to recognize have sometimes been so isolated in the fight for clean air, clean water, that they have not even had the luxury of imagining what is possible when we talk about a clean transition. And so, through project deployment, thinking about how, yes, we can have demonstrated projects, but we can also boost green awareness and really spark the imagination of what is possible in communities, on the front lines. Number 3, thinking about how the activities of the Green Bank can boost climate resilience and enable communities to adapt to the coming impacts of climate change. We know that there's a certain level of impact that is already baked in, even as we make the transition to a clean economy. We have to ask the question of what is the role in deploying projects that actually undergird community resiliency to ensure that folks who have been most impacted don't remain that way. Number 4, going back to the entrepreneurial and wealth generation opportunities of capitalizing and increasing demand for local businesses, looking at the adjacent workforce deployment to ensure that there is adequate and diverse representation in who is getting the clean energy jobs that are associated with the Green Bank activity. And then number 5, and I think most importantly, is facilitating community input in a just transition, meaning that we have to develop a robust mechanism to go have conversation with communities and actually climb what I call the knowledge curve and the trust curve, having really robust conversations to ensure that we are being responsive to community needs and wants and not imposing what we think is best for people who are living these realities day in and day out. And in doing that, I think we make an incredible step not only in advancing clean energy deployment, but actually winning on environmental, climate, and energy justice for generations to come.
Great. Thank you, Will. Let me take one question that was in the Q&A that we got. The question is, with this size of investment coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, what are some of the largest potential risks that big banks will grab outside profits and reduce the overall impact? And what are some of the best way to structure the green banks to avoid that? I guess let me start with Reed. Could you answer that and see if other people want to join in?
You know, I guess I kind of want to pass the book to Brian because he's had 10 years of experience of negotiating with, major financial institutions. And I think he's managed to keep them from grabbing, what was the phrase, an outsized profits? Brian, how can you speak to that?
Sure. I think right at the outset, if you looked at the 27 billion, clearly Congress is sending a signal about the importance of this investment going to disadvantaged communities, low-income communities. You've got the $7 billion zero-emission technologies piece that clearly articulates low-income and disadvantaged communities. You've got the 8 billion that's identified for low-income and disadvantaged communities, and then the 12 billion for the rest. So 15 of 27. Now, I would say that our responsibilities as green banks, CDFIs, in this marketplace is to ensure that more investment goes to disadvantaged communities of that proportion. Now, in terms of how we ensure that those proceeds, those profits, the more profit people take off the table, the more benefits they're taking away from the communities we're trying to support, right? So a 1% increase in interest rates takes off from the energy burden reductions from the participating households that we want to see. So as William is laying clearly out for all of us, we want to maximize all those benefits to our targeted low-income and disadvantaged communities, whether that's energy burden reduction, whether that's increasing energy security, whether that is reducing environmental justice impacts in our communities, creating wealth in our communities. It feels to me like one of the areas, Kathy, that we haven't delved into as a green bank, but I know some colleagues in Illinois have, is this question about providing financing to the contractors on the ground who are doing this work. So to your point, Will, about wealth creation and building, minority-owned institutions who are doing this work in our communities. In Connecticut, we're behind. If we look at those numbers, sure, on the energy consumption side, we're ahead, or we're making great progress, but we still have a ways to go in terms of companies owned by women and minority institutions and people being employed. So it feels to me like the concept of working capital and providing loans to those businesses and helping them build and grow alongside providing access to capital to the families and businesses to do the measures. If we attack it from both of those sides, we're going to be building this green economy that we want to see, which is lifting everybody up, especially our most vulnerable. So it's kind of built into the statute, the legislation a bit, but all of us, who will be implementers of it, feel it. We are driven by it, and most definitely will move beyond the 40%.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to add anything to that answer?
I'll just do a big plus one on that. I think it's in the, there's a very strong focus on there being this going towards efforts that would not otherwise occur. And I think, the commercial, large banks, they've certainly had considerable hand in creating the problems. I think as the economy is greening, they may also have a hand in investing in some solutions. But the critical nature of public dollars is investing in those activities that would not be done otherwise. And I think that's really a great space to be considering this and ensuring that this is actually directed to those activities that, but for this capital might not otherwise occur. And I love your point, Brian, about, this is really a great opportunity, certainly in order to see the activities proliferate, in low-income communities, in communities of color, we have to be expanding and really focusing on investing in and building businesses that are engaged in and working in the communities that where we want the capital to flow. And so it's such a perfect kind of virtuous cycle. So very much agree.
And Ken, maybe I could just add the footnote, to my two friends and the excellent things they've said. So, we're in a very tough time, right? Meaning, for 13 years, we've had a low interest rate environment that was created by the actions taken by the Obama administration in reaction to the crisis of 2008. It's not only been a low interest rate environment, it's been stable as a low interest rate environment. And now in just the last 6 months, we have rising interest rates, rising inflation, roughly a 40% increase already in energy cost, projected increases in electricity prices that are have never been seen in the last 30 years. Meaning the predicted increases that are going to stretch out into time have not been seen in decades. In that environment, the energy burden that Brian was talking about, it's even higher. And yet the ability to borrow the money in order to install the device that would lower the energy usage or take the price down, well, now it's harder and harder to borrow that money at these higher interest rates. So that's a terrible squeeze. That's the reason that we need to exist, right? That's the reason we need to get that 20 billion, leverage it, put it on a balance sheet that Kathy has identified that gets another 10x leverage. In other words, every kind of leverage is not imprudent or speculative, because the institutions we're talking about have a track record of being very prudent without defaults. We just have to have it be that the amount of money that's available to deal with these emerging crises is sufficient to meet the scale of the challenge. And that's why I believe so strongly we have to aggregate it at the top or under that umbrella, and then have the biggest possible number of participants underneath the umbrella in order to be able to leave nobody out.
Thank you, Reed. If I can just add one thing to what Reed said, politically, we're talking about a major transformation of the U.S. economy. To build the public support we need, I think we need to show people that this transition is going to lead to, in the long run, lower energy costs for everyone, and it's going to be very, very equitably divided, that we will not leave low and middle income communities out of this, that they will receive the same benefits that wealthier communities receive. I think the green banks, as we've been saying, can play an outsized role in making sure that we can do this economically, particularly in low and middle income communities, but in many, many other places too. And that's increasingly important today, as Reed said. And we all have to figure out how to get that message across to people that, in fact, this is happening in a very complicated environment when people look at their energy bills and what's happening. So again, I think the Green Bank can play a critical role there. Now, unfortunately, our time is coming to a close. Thank you to everyone in the audience for tuning in, and especially to our panelists for participating in this lively discussion. Thank you for sharing the opportunities for the Biden administration to leverage the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund in the Inflation Reduction Act. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center in organizing in this event. I'd like to thank a few people in particular for helping to put this event together, including Mia Sparkman, Lizzie Bowen, and Rebecca Mencham-Nance. This presentation is available on the Atlantic Council website, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please share it with your colleagues. So to conclude, I just again like to say thank you everyone in the audience for joining us and for your insightful questions. And I'd like to thank everybody on the panel again for doing, making terrific presentations and making this, financial issues are always complicated, making these issues very clear to everyone. So thank you again.